Hello guys, welcome to another video, and it's that time of the League release cycle once again. It's time for a tradition here on this channel. It is 3 buffs and 3 nerf predictions for patch 3.25 Settlers of Kalguur. Let's go. We're beginning with the buffs, and it's Ancestral Totems for melee. Ancestral Totem buffs have created an awkward playstyle for melee since their inception, one that requires the average melee build to maintain the buffs granted by both Ancestral Warchief and Ancestral Protector for their respective more melee damage and more attack speed buffs that they provide. And it's not like you can ignore these buffs either. Together they typically make up around 50% of the damage of a melee build. And so you need to maintain these buffs whenever you need to be dealing the most damage. And the problem is, the buffs are tied to the totems, and the totems die very easily. They die a lot. There was a band-aid fix in the form of lingering buffs acquirable from the totem mastery, but that's just another passive point spent to solve a problem that simply shouldn't exist. And even then, you're only making the playstyle a little bit less irritating. But there's hope. And this is why the Ancestral Totem buffs are my #1 buff prediction for 3.25. Ever since the PoE2 interview in January of this year from Rise, Ziggy and Noogie with developers Rory and Jonathan, changes to this mechanic have seemed like a very real possibility in the near future. I thought changes may have come in patch 3.24, but it seems that this realization came a little too late in the development cycle to make it into that release. During this interview, the group got into the topic of melee totems in PoE2, and Jonathan seemingly came to the realization in this very moment that Ancestral Totems in PoE1 are poorly designed and they need to be changed, even going as far as to question why they were even added in the first place. I'll link the video that I made a while back on that topic below if you'd like to see the full exchange with the devs. The important takeaway here, however, was Jonathan closing out by saying that he'd suggest to Mark that Ancestral Totems should be changed in PoE1. But that's not all, because during a more recent interview conducted by Zizaran with lead developer Mark Roberts at the start of the Necropolis League, Zizaran asked Mark about Ancestral Totems and melee in general. And Mark mentioned that melee was a, quote, tier 1 feature on his 3.25 list of things that he wants to get sorted. So with these two pieces of information together, I think that Ancestral Totem changes will be coming sooner or later, and I'm hopeful that it will be in this upcoming league. For buff prediction number 2, I've got unique item balance, or buffs and reworks to unique items. I think more specifically, this will be unique weapons used by melee characters or melee adjacent unique items. The sheer amount of unique weapons which have been completely left behind in terms of power creep in the last 10 or 15 leagues is insane. And whilst I do believe that it's a good idea that a very good crafted weapon is most of the time superior to a unique one, the issue here is that there are so many really interesting unique items in the game that would be fun to build around if it wasn't for the fact that doing so just completely gimps your build from the get-go. Some examples for unique weapons that I could see getting numerical buffs or more significant changes are Razor of the Seventh Sun, Fate of the Val, the Yielding Mortality, Hegemony's Era, Calm's Primacy, Rain Rattler, Doomsower, and the list could go on and on. The last balance pass on unique weapons was in patch 3.20 Sanctum League, but that one really only covered the very rare or endgame situated weapons, such as Morohi Urki or Voidforge. A lot of the more common and uncommon unique weapons have lost their place in the game and require balance. And what better time for that to happen than a patch where melee is a top contender to be addressed. And the final of 3 predictions for the buffs in patch 3.25 is Ascendancy changes, and once again I think this is going to have a melee focus. The obvious candidates here are Gladiator and Berserker, but I also think Raider is a very real possibility, and Assassin is a really interesting one, especially if they decide to lean into the whole melee dagger archetype, which needs a lot more support if it's ever going to be a thing in the game. Gladiator is the most in need of these 4 Ascendancies, with melee bleed and dual wield melee being as weak as they are right now. Those parts of the passive skill tree would also require changes. While Raider is an Ascendancy which could and probably should represent right side melee builds with the support for both dual wielding and one-handed melee archetypes. We do know that all the way back before patch 3.21 Crucible League, GGG had a bunch of Ascendancy changes mapped out, but they felt that they weren't quite polished enough, so they held back on them. We've seen some of those changes in the patches since then, but not all that they were letting on, so I would expect at least one of the melee Ascendancies to be addressed in patch 3.25. My money is on the Gladiator. Next up, we've got the 3 nerf predictions, beginning with player Detonate Dead, where the popularity of DD in Necropolis essentially pushed this skill over the edge, and it's now firmly in the territory where things start to get nerfed. DD has been strong for a very long time, but its playstyle has hindered its popularity across each league. However, in Necropolis, Rutu's cast on crit chain DD Inquisitor build was all that was needed for the skill to pick up a more wide-scale adoption across the player base. Going from a 2-button build to a 1-button setup was enough for many to pick this skill up for the first time, and both normal and chain DD have the very distinct advantage over many other abilities of requiring extremely minimal setup and gearing to get going, easily outperforming other builds. Expect both DD and chain DD to receive sharp nerfs to the corpse explosion percentage damage component of the ability. Overwhelm on monsters is a problem which became very apparent during patch 3.19 Kalandra League following the arch-nemesis rare monster overhaul, but even prior to this, the existence of things such as 100% Overwhelm on exploded expedition remnants simply doesn't make a whole lot of sense, when other offensive monster modifiers on the very same mechanic include 15% penetration to a damage type. Those 2 modifiers are not even remotely equal in terms of power level, but Expedition isn't the only offender, because even normal rare monsters that can appear anywhere in Path of Exile can spawn with a modifier which overwhelms 30% of physical damage reduction. And then of course, most recently we had the Lantern modifiers as part of the unskippable Necropolis League mechanic, which also contained Overwhelm modifiers on monsters, those of which would stack on top of pre-existing modifiers on monsters in that map. For reasons unknown to everyone, Monster Overwhelm has always had obscene values compared to other stats, which has led to widespread take-up of damage taken as to shift physical damage taken into other types, as the go-to way to solve physical damage hits on many builds, including characters originating on the left side of the passive tree, where all of the armor and endurance charge scaling exists, and it's pretty obvious why this has become a thing. If armor is unreliable as a defensive mechanic, even after you've potentially invested a 50% aura and points on the passive skill tree into scaling it, then damage taken as becomes so much more appealing, as you can ignore Overwhelm on the portion of damage that was shifted, making it much more reliable. So whilst I feel that Monster Overwhelm will be changed, either numerically or mechanically, the third and final nerf prediction is part of the same problem. That's damage taken as. As I've just been discussing, damage taken as has been an exceedingly good way to deal with physical damage hits for a long time. This can be traced back to a few specific changes. First, the addition of Eldritch Implicits in patch 3.17, including damage taken as on the helmet. This change improved the total amount of this stat one could gain from this slot, because you're able to stack it with an existing explicit modifier, also for damage taken as, either from Betrayal or Delve. In the same patch, the Dawnbreaker unique shield was introduced, providing even more of this stat from a gear slot which previously didn't have any outside of Corrupted Implicits. Then in patch 3.19, the Lightning Coil and Cloak of Flame unique body armors were significantly buffed, providing a huge chunk of damage taken as. Access to damage taken as modifiers has crept up over time, while the effectiveness of other methods of mitigating physical damage hits have diminished or simply been left behind. I expect that either access to damage taken as modifiers will be limited by nerfing the values on those modifiers, or the penalties for using those items, such as the negative lightning resistance on the lightning coil, will be increased. Regardless, one of the recent teasers for patch 3.25 Settlers of Kalguur seemingly shows off a nerf Determination aura, and I think it's somewhat unlikely that Determination would be nerfed without monster Overwhelm or player damage taken as, or even both, receiving changes as well. But what about you? What are your predictions for Path of Exile 3.25 Settlers of Kalguur? Let me know by commenting below. As always, thank you to my patrons for supporting this channel. If you enjoy the content I make here on YouTube, check out the Patreon that I've linked in the description below for details on how you can support the channel going forward. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.